By the second winter of the war, the smokehouse was empty, stripped by Confederate officers feeding an army that was already losing. The people who had been feeding that plantation all along buried cornmeal in the fireplace ashes and pulled out bread with their bare hands. They set eel traps in the creek at dusk and checked them before dawn. Number 14 on this list was hunted at night without a single shot fired. Number 7 started at a creek bank after dark with nothing but bare hands. The Civil War forced black families to turn almost nothing into enough. Hit subscribe because this story deserves to be told out loud. Here are 25 meals black families ate to survive the Civil War. Number 25, ash cake, cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt, shaped into a flat round, wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves or collard greens, and buried directly in the hot ashes of the hearth. No pan, no oven, no table. The leaves kept the ash from sticking to the meal, and the trapped steam cooked the bread through in the time it took to mend a shirt or feed the animals. When the cake was pulled from the coals and the charred leaves were peeled away, the inside was dense, faintly smoky, and warm enough to fill a stomach that had been empty since morning. Ash cake needed nothing but fire and meal, and both of those existed in every cabin in the South. It was the first bread most enslaved children learned to make, and during the war, when skillets were seized or hidden and proper baking was a memory, the hearth itself became the cookware. Number 24, poke salad. Pokeweed shoots picked young in the spring before the stems turned purple and the leaves grew bitter with poison. The raw plant could make a person violently sick, and everyone who gathered it knew that. The greens had to be boiled in at least 2 changes of water, sometimes 3, each pot drained and refilled until the toxins washed out, and what remained was tender, dark, and faintly slippery, like spinach with more weight behind it. Poke salad was scrambled with eggs when eggs were available, or eaten plain with cornbread and potlikker. It grew wild in disturbed soil along fence rows, burned clearings, and the edges of fields, which meant it showed up exactly where people who had been pushed to the margins already lived. During the war, when cultivated greens were trampled or taken, pokeweed kept coming back on its own, unbothered by armies or seasons. Number 23, hickory nut milk. Hickory trees dropped their nuts across the southern woods every autumn, and the nuts were hard to crack but worth the effort. The kernels were pounded in a mortar or crushed between 2 rocks until they broke into small pieces, shells and all, then boiled in water. The shell fragments sank. The oils and the flavor rose to the surface and turned the water into something rich and white that looked and behaved like milk. The liquid was strained and used for cooking cornbread, thickening broth, or drinking straight. It carried a fat content that plain water never could, and for families with no cow and no way to keep one safe from foraging troops, hickory nut milk was the closest thing to cream that the woods could offer. Number 22, smoked eel from the river. Eels lived in the mud at the bottom of southern rivers and creeks, caught with woven traps set overnight in shallow water where the current slowed. The traps were simple, made from split cane, and they worked on a principle people had used for centuries: a funnel entrance the eel could swim into but not back out of. The caught eels were gutted, split open, and hung over a low fire to smoke until the flesh turned firm and dark. Smoked eel kept for days without spoiling and could be eaten cold, straight from the hand, or dropped into a pot of greens to season the broth the way salt pork did. The flavor was rich and oily, stronger than any freshwater fish, and a single smoked eel stretched further than its size suggested. During the war, eel traps sat in creeks that no army thought to patrol, pulling food from the water while the land above it was being stripped clean. Number 21, sorghum cake. Sorghum grew across the upper South in fields that no one fought over because the Confederate Army had no use for it. The stalks were pressed, the juice boiled down into a thick amber syrup, and that syrup became the only sweetener most black families had access to for the duration of the war. Mixed into cornmeal batter with a little water and baked in the ashes, sorghum turned plain bread into something with color and sweetness. The cake was dense and dark, heavier than cornbread, with a depth that came entirely from the land. No cane sugar, no white flour, no imported anything. Sorghum was a crop that survived the war because nobody considered it worth stealing. That made it one of the most reliable ingredients in a kitchen where reliability had become the rarest thing of all. Number 20, Potlikker. The liquid left in the pot after greens had been boiled low with whatever pork scrap was on hand. Turnip greens, collards, dandelion leaves, whatever grew or could be found. The greens themselves were food, but the broth they left behind carried most of the nourishment, dark and rich, with the minerals that had cooked out of the leaves and the fat that had melted off the bone. Potlikker was sopped up with cornbread or drunk straight from a cup, and in households where the greens had to stretch across too many mouths, the liquor was sometimes the only portion the youngest children received. During the war, a pot of greens could feed a family twice, once with the leaves and once with the broth the next morning, reheated over whatever fire was safe to build. Here is something worth saying plainly. Every meal on this list existed before the war started. Black families on southern plantations had been cooking this way for generations, not because they were preparing for a crisis, but because crisis was the permanent condition. The weekly ration was never enough. The cuts of meat handed out were never the ones worth having. The garden patch behind the quarters was never large enough for the number of mouths it fed. What the war changed was not the cooking. It changed what was left to cook with. Confederate requisition officers stripped smokehouse shelves, confiscated livestock, and redirected grain supplies to feed soldiers. The margins that had been thin in peacetime disappeared entirely, but the knowledge did not disappear with them. The families who had spent generations learning how to feed themselves from scraps and wild ground and rejected animal parts were the families best equipped to survive when the formal food supply collapsed. The war did not teach resilience, it revealed skill that had been there all along. Number 19, hominy. Dried corn soaked in lye water made from hardwood ash until the tough outer hull loosened and slipped off, and the kernels swelled to twice their original size. The lye broke down the part of the corn that the human body cannot digest on its own, unlocking nourishment that raw or parched corn locks away. Cultures across the Americas had known this for thousands of years before anyone called it science. Hominy was rinsed, boiled until soft, and eaten with salt pork or sorghum, or dried again and ground into grits that could be stored for months. During the war, when wheat flour vanished and cornmeal ran low, hominy stretched what little corn remained into something that went further and fed deeper. A single bushel of dried corn became nearly 2 bushels of hominy, and that arithmetic kept families alive when nothing else added up. Number 18, raccoon baked with turnips. Raccoon was hunted at night, treed by dogs, or trapped along creek banks where the animals came to wash their food. The meat was strong and fatty, with a flavor that divided opinion even among people who had been eating wild game their whole lives. Parboiling the carcass first, sometimes twice, pulled the worst of the musk out and left the meat tender enough to roast. Packed in a pot with turnips and whatever root vegetables were available, the raccoon baked slowly over low coals until the fat rendered into the roots and the meat went soft. The turnips soaked up the drippings and turned sweet. A single raccoon fed a larger group than a rabbit ever could, and during the war years, that arithmetic mattered more than taste. Number 17, persimmon beer. Ripe persimmons gathered after the first frost, when the fruit had softened past the point most people would touch it, mashed in a wooden trough or bucket, mixed with water and a handful of cornmeal or wheat bran, and left to ferment in a warm corner of the cabin for several days. What came out was mildly alcoholic, slightly sweet, and fizzy enough to feel like something more than water. Persimmon beer was one of the oldest drinks in the rural South, older than bourbon and older than most of the towns where it was made. During the war, when coffee was gone and tea was a rumor and clean water meant walking to a spring that might not be safe, persimmon beer was flavor and comfort pulled from a tree that nobody owned and nobody could confiscate. The fruit fell on its own. All it asked for was time. Number 16, salt pork and cowpeas. A chunk of salt pork dropped into a pot of dried cowpeas and simmered for hours until the beans went soft and the pork fell apart into salty strings that flavored every spoonful. This was the one-pot meal that anchored the weekly rations on plantations across the Cotton South. The salt pork was preserved, shelf-stable, and handed out by weight. The cowpeas were dried and stored by the barrel. Together, they made something that could feed a family from a single vessel with nothing added but water and time. During the war, salt pork was one of the last provisions to disappear from plantation stores because the Confederate Army preferred fresh beef and bacon and left the salt barrels for last. What the Army passed over kept black families fed when nearly everything else had been taken. Number 15, rabbit, snared with twine, trapped with a wooden box propped on a stick or run down by hand in an open field. Rabbit was the most available wild meat in the wartime South. It required no gun, no shot, no powder, nothing that was being rationed or confiscated by military authorities. A rabbit could be skinned and cooking over a fire within the hour. During the war, when the sound of a gunshot in the woods could draw patrols and foraging parties, silent trapping became the safest way to put meat on the table. The meat was lean, almost too lean without some fat to cook it in, but a rabbit stewed slowly with wild onions and whatever root vegetables could be pulled from the ground was a real meal at a time when real meals were running out fast. By 1863, tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people had crossed Union lines and gathered in what the federal government called contraband camps. These were not refugee camps in any modern sense. They were overcrowded, undersupplied, and often built on land seized from Confederate planters. The food was whatever the Union Army could spare: hardtack, salt beef, and sometimes coffee. But the people in those camps did not sit and wait to be fed. They planted gardens in the margins. They fished the nearest rivers and trapped game in the surrounding woods. They pooled rations and cooked communally, stretching military provisions with the same techniques they had used on plantations for generations. What emerged from those camp kitchens was not charity. It was the same independent food system that had kept families alive for decades, transplanted to new ground and running on the same engine: knowledge, cooperation, and the refusal to depend entirely on someone else's willingness to provide. Number 14, possum baked with root vegetables. Possum was a night animal, slow and easy to catch, found in every stretch of southern woods from the Piedmont to the coast. It could be treed by dogs, grabbed by the tail from a low branch, or trapped with a wooden box and a scrap of bait. No gun, no noise, no announcement to anyone within earshot that meat had just been taken. The animal was scalded to remove the hair, cleaned, and soaked in salt water overnight to pull some of the wild flavor out of the fat. The next morning, It went into a deep pot surrounded by whatever root vegetables could be found. Sweet potatoes when the garden still had them. Turnips when it did not. Wild onions pulled from the woods. The pot was covered and set over low coals for hours until the fat rendered into the vegetables and the meat went so tender it pulled away from the bone with a spoon. The taste divided families. The fat was heavy, the flavor gamey, and the texture unlike any domesticated meat. But possum had qualities that mattered more than flavor during the war years. It was abundant, it was quiet to catch, and it was large enough that a single animal, properly cooked, fed a family and left broth for the following day. Possum hunting became a communal event in the quarters. A group went out after dark, following the dogs or walking the fence lines with a lantern, and what they caught was shared. The hunt carried a social weight that went beyond the meat. It was organized cooperation outside the control of anyone who claimed to own the land or the people on it. The decision to hunt, the route, the division of the catch, all of it was self-governed. After the war, possum suppers became a fixture of Black community life across the rural South. Political gatherings, church fundraisers, and family reunions featured the dish well into the 20th century. The animal that had been survival food during the worst years became celebration food in the decades that followed, not because anyone forgot what it once meant, but precisely because they remembered. Number 13, sweet potato vine greens. Most people grew sweet potatoes for what was underground, but the vines that sprawled across the soil above were edible too. The young leaves and tender tips were picked, washed, and cooked down the same way as any pot of greens, wilted in a skillet with a little fat, or simmered in water until they went soft. The flavor was mild, greener, and lighter than collards, without the bitterness of mustard greens. A single sweet potato hill produced vines all summer long, and cutting the tips did not hurt the tubers growing below. It was 2 crops from one planting, and during the war, when seed was scarce and every row of garden soil had to earn its place twice over, sweet potato vines fed the family above ground while the roots fed them below. Number 12, Jerusalem artichokes roasted in the coals. They were not artichokes, and they had nothing to do with Jerusalem. They were the tubers of a native sunflower growing wild across the South in sandy soil and along riverbanks. Indigenous peoples had cultivated them for centuries, and Black families in the South knew exactly where to dig for them. Pulled from the ground and buried in the hot coals of a fireplace, they roasted until the skin blackened and the inside turned soft and sweet, with the flavor closer to a nutty potato than to anything else on the table. During the war, they were free food growing in places no one thought to guard or requisition. A family that knew where the sunchokes grew had a root vegetable that came back every year without being planted. Number 11, hardtack soaked in pork drippings. Hardtack was a Union Army ration, a dense brick of flour and water baked until nearly indestructible. It could crack a tooth eaten dry. But in contraband camps, formerly enslaved families received hardtack and did what they always did with food that arrived in difficult form. They fixed it, pork drippings, potlikker, or plain water, turned that brick into something soft enough to chew. Some crumbled the softened pieces into a skillet with grease and fried them until the edges crisped. Others broke it into a bowl and poured whatever hot liquid they had over the top. The Union called it a ration. The people who ate it called it another thing that needed transforming before it was fit for the table. Number 10, dried peach leather. Peach trees grew across the South, and in summers before the war, the fruit was so plentiful that much of it fell to the ground and rotted. But during the war years, nothing was left to rot. Ripe peaches were mashed into a pulp and spread thin on a flat board or a piece of clean cloth. then set in the sun to dry for days until the pulp turned into a leathery sheet that could be rolled up and stored. The leather kept for months. It was chewy, intensely sweet, and portable. Children ate it like candy. Mothers packed it alongside other rations for food that provided both sustenance and comfort. A single peach tree in the yard, left standing when everything else had been stripped, could produce enough leather to last a family deep into winter. Number 9, dock greens. Yellow dock grew everywhere the ground had been turned, beside roads, along fence lines, at the edges of plowed fields. The leaves were tough and sour, nothing like the tender greens from a tended garden, but they were edible, available, and growing in places no one thought to guard or confiscate. Dock greens were gathered by the armful, washed and boiled in salted water until the bitterness cooked down and the leaves went soft. They were eaten plain or with a piece of salt meat laid across the top of the pot for flavor. The broth left behind was saved and used to cook the next meal. Dock was not a plant anyone would choose if better greens were growing. But during the war, when the kitchen garden had been trampled or stripped by foraging troops, dock was what the roadsides offered, and the roadsides never ran out. Number 8, cattail root. Cattails grew thick in every marsh, pond edge, and drainage ditch across the South. Most people walked past them without a second look, but the roots, pulled from the mud and washed clean, held a starchy white core that could be peeled, dried, and pounded into a flour that mixed with cornmeal or stood on its own. The flour was dense and faintly sweet, and it baked into flat cakes over a fire or thickened a pot of broth when nothing else was available to stretch the meal. The young shoots, pulled in spring before the plant flowered, could be eaten raw or boiled, with a mild taste somewhere between cucumber and something greener. A stand of cattails at the edge of a pond produced more usable food than most people realized, and during the war, that ignorance was its own kind of protection. The families who knew what grew in the marshes had a food source hiding in plain sight. Every meal on this list shares one quality. None of them were invented during the Civil War. They were all older than the conflict itself. Some were older than the country, carried across the Atlantic in the memory of people who were given nothing else to bring. What the war did was strip away the last thin margin of comfort that peacetime had allowed and force these meals to carry the full weight of survival on their own. The cooking did not change. The stakes did. A pot of broth in 1858 was Tuesday supper. A pot of broth in 1863 was the difference between a family that held together and one that fell apart. The African roots of this cooking run deeper than most people recognize. The techniques, the crops, the instinct to build a complete meal from scraps and wild plants and overlooked parts of an animal, none of it was improvised in America. It was transplanted, adapted, and kept alive by the people who had carried the original knowledge across the water. Number 7, crayfish from the creek, caught at night by hand in the shallow stretches of every creek and branch that ran through the southern lowlands. Crayfish lived under rocks and in the muddy banks, and they came out after dark when the water cooled. A bucket, a pair of hands, and the knowledge of which creek bends held the most were all it took. Children learned to catch them young. The technique was simple. Wade in slowly, feel along the bottom. Close your hand fast when you felt the hard shell and the snap of the claws. A good night produced enough crayfish to fill a pot. They were boiled in salted water until they turned red, then cracked open and eaten with the fingers. The tail meat was sweet and firm. The heads, sucked clean, gave up a briny liquid that some families saved and used as seasoning for the next day's greens. During the Civil War, crayfish became one of the most dependable sources of animal protein available to families whose rations had been cut to almost nothing. The creeks did not run dry. The crayfish did not migrate. They were there every night in the same bins, in the same numbers, no matter which army had marched through that week or which supplies had been confiscated from the storehouse. No one could requisition a creek bed. No foraging party thought to sweep a shallow branch for food that lived under rocks. The crayfish belonged to the people who knew they were there, and those people had learned the creeks the way they had learned everything else, by watching, by doing, and by being sent out into the dark by a mother who needed something in the pot by morning. The tradition did not end with the war. Crayfish boils became a cornerstone of Louisiana cooking, and the technique of catching them by hand in shallow water survived in rural communities across the South well into the 20th century. A child who learned to catch crayfish in 1863 taught a grandchild the same skill decades later. The creek changed. The hands did not. Number 6, sassafras tea. The roots of the sassafras tree were dug from the woods, scrubbed clean, and boiled in water until the liquid turned reddish brown and the kitchen smelled like root beer. Sassafras. Tea was the drink of families who had no coffee, no imported tea, and no money for either. The tree grew everywhere in the southern woods, and the roots were available year-round. During the war, when the Union naval blockade cut off coffee imports and the price of real tea climbed beyond the reach of nearly everyone in the rural South, sassafras became the default hot drink. It carried a mild sweetness on its own and took well to a spoonful of sorghum or honey when either was available. Sassafras tea required no ration, no purchase, and no permission. A shovel, a pot, and a fire were all it needed. The tree kept giving as long as someone knew which roots to pull and how deep to dig. Number 5, groundnut stew. The groundnut was not a peanut. It was a wild tuber that grew on vines along riverbanks and damp woodland edges across the South, with a taste somewhere between a potato and a roasted chestnut. The roots were dug from the mud, scrubbed, sliced, and simmered in water with whatever else was available: a piece of dried meat, wild onion, a handful of field peas. The stew thickened on its own as the tubers broke down, and the broth turned starchy and filling without flour or fat. Groundnuts had fed indigenous peoples in the region for centuries before enslaved families learned to find them, and during the war, when gardens were destroyed and stored food was seized, the vines along the creeks kept producing underground where no army thought to look. A pot of groundnut stew asked for nothing but a knife, a fire, and the knowledge of where to dig. Number 4, slippery elm bark gruel. The inner bark of the slippery elm tree, stripped from branches and dried, produced a soft powder that turned into a thick, smooth gruel when stirred into hot water. The texture was unusual, almost gelatinous, but the gruel was gentle on the stomach and filling enough to count as a meal when nothing else would stay down. Families used it to feed the sick, the very old, and the very young, people whose bodies could not handle the rough, heavy food that made up most of the wartime diet. A child with a fever, a grandmother whose teeth were gone, a mother recovering from childbirth in a cabin with no doctor and no medicine beyond what the woods provided. Slippery elm gruel was the food of last resort and first mercy, the meal that asked the least of the body while giving it something to hold on to. During the war, the trees stood in the woods unbothered, and the bark peeled easily in spring when the sap was rising. Number 3, rice and field peas. In the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, where rice plantations ran on the labor and knowledge of enslaved West Africans, rice was the foundation of every meal. Field peas were planted between the rows and harvested alongside the rice. The two were cooked together in a single pot, the rice absorbing the broth from the simmering peas, the peas providing protein the rice could never deliver alone. This combination had crossed the Atlantic from West Africa, where rice and legumes had been paired for centuries. During the war, low country plantations were among the first occupied by Union forces, and many formerly enslaved families stayed on the land and kept planting what they knew. Rice and field peas survived the war because the people who grew them refused to stop. Number 2, fried perch from the mill pond. Perch was smaller than catfish and easier to catch, running in schools through the still water of plantation mill ponds and farm reservoirs. A hook baited with a worm or a cricket pulled them in one after another, fast enough that a child could fill a bucket before the sun went down. The fish were cleaned on the bank and fried whole in whatever fat was available, dredged in cornmeal first so the skin crisped and the flesh stayed moist inside the coating. Perch were bony, and eating them required patience, pulling each thin bone free with the fingers before getting to the small flake of white meat underneath. But a platter of fried perch with nothing beside it but cold cornbread was a meal that tasted like the pond itself, clean and self-sufficient. During the war, the mill pond kept producing fish long after the smokehouse had been emptied. Water fed what the land could no longer provide. Number 1, the cook's portion. There was always one bowl left. The cook ate last. She served everyone. At the table, watched the pot go down and scrape what remained into her own dish. The cook's portion was never the best piece or the fullest serving. It was whatever the pot still held after every other mouth had been fed. During the Civil War, the cook's portion shrank to almost nothing. The pot held less, the mouths around it did not. But the cook still ate last because feeding others first was not a sacrifice anyone asked for. It was a position held by the person who understood the food better than anyone else in the room, the person who knew exactly how far the meal would stretch and how much could be spared. Every meal on this list passed through her hands. She buried the ash cake. She boiled the greens 3 times. She dressed the game and set the traps. She kept the fire. The cook's portion was the smallest bowl on the table and the most important one in the kitchen because it meant the person who held everything together was still standing.
Chicken and dumpling soup with drop dumplings offered comfort when families needed it most, simmering in countless kitchens during the Civil Rights era. A whole chicken was boiled with onions, celery, and carrots until the broth turned rich and fragrant, then pulled apart to yield tender pieces of meat. Instead of carefully rolled dough, quick spoonfuls of soft batter were dropped directly into the bubbling stock, where they puffed into pillowy dumplings that soaked up every ounce of flavor. This faster method made the dish accessible to busy mothers balancing long workdays and community meetings while still wanting to serve something hearty and nourishing. Each bowl carried the scent of thyme and black pepper, filling homes with warmth that went beyond simple calories. It was the taste of Sunday afternoons, of neighbors stopping by with cornbread, of quiet strength in the face of daily challenges. Over the decades, packaged soups and rotisserie chickens replaced the slow ritual, and the drop dumpling style slowly vanished, leaving behind only the memory of shared tables and the gentle comfort of broth and dough mingling together in perfect harmony. Fried bologna on white bread was one of the most common breakfasts for working families during the Civil Rights era. Bologna was affordable, and frying it in a skillet brought out flavor and made it feel more substantial. Layered on soft white bread with mustard or hot sauce, it became a sandwich that was cheap, quick, and filling. For children, it was often packed as lunch, but for adults, it was breakfast before long shifts in fields, factories, or offices. The salty, savory taste was familiar and comforting, even if it came from one of the cheapest meats available. Fried bologna sandwiches symbolized both thrift and practicality, reflecting the reality of what many households relied on to get by. They were humble, but they carried enough strength to power people through demanding days. This dish became part of the memory of struggle and perseverance, a reminder that even inexpensive food could play a role in fueling determination and resilience. Black walnut cake had a deep, earthy taste that made it different from lighter, more common cakes. Black walnuts were not easy to come by, but they could be foraged in rural areas where families had long learned to make the most of nature's gifts. Cracking the shells and pulling out the nut meats was hard work, yet people did it because the result was worth it. This cake stood as a symbol of resourcefulness and care, since every slice carried hours of labor hidden inside. During the Civil Rights era, desserts like this often appeared at fellowship meals, with women proudly setting them down on long tables as proof of skill and dedication. A black walnut cake was never about extravagance. It was about showing love through the effort it took to create. For those who grew up tasting it, the flavor instantly recalled a time when people worked together to survive and celebrate despite limited means. Sweet corn spoonbread emerged from church suppers and family reunions as a dish that blended Native American corn traditions with Southern creativity. Freshly ground cornmeal and whole kernels were whisked into a custard of milk, eggs, and a knob of butter, then baked until the edges set while the center stayed soft and almost pudding-like. Served hot straight from the oven, it needed nothing more than a pat of butter melting across the top to make everyone at the table smile. Children loved its sweetness, adults loved its gentle richness, and cooks loved how forgiving it was when made in a hurry. Spoonbread appeared at potlucks that doubled as strategy meetings, where activists gathered for strength and neighbors shared what they could. It was inexpensive yet festive, a dish that welcomed everyone to take a big spoonful and feel at home. As instant mixes and boxed cornbread gained popularity, the slow-baked spoonbread quietly disappeared, but the memory of its creamy texture and golden aroma still evokes the spirit of generosity and unity that defined the era's most important gatherings. Cracklin' cornbread was a dish that brought a little joy and extra nourishment to the table, especially during times of struggle. Made by folding pork cracklings into traditional cornbread batter, it added both protein and crunch to a meal that was usually simple. Pork skins and fat were cheap and rarely wasted, and incorporating them into cornbread gave households a way to make breakfast more sustaining. Served hot from the skillet, cracklin' cornbread was filling enough to carry families through demanding days. It became a staple for marches, farm work, or long hours in factories, offering both flavor and strength. Children remembered the satisfying crunch, while adults valued the resourcefulness that turned scraps into sustenance. Cracklin' cornbread reflected a deeper story about resilience, showing how families took pride in making the most of what they had. More than just food, it symbolized unity at the table and fuel for the struggles ahead, keeping spirits alive through its warmth and heartiness. Boiled custard was a holiday tradition that warmed households and filled church halls with its sweet, spiced aroma. Unlike eggnog, which was heavier, boiled custard was light but rich enough to feel festive. Made with eggs, sugar, and milk, it was whisked over heat until it thickened into a drink that everyone could share. In many communities, it became a centerpiece of Christmas gatherings, poured into cups and passed around after evening services. For African American families during the Civil Rights era, sharing boiled custard meant more than marking a holiday. It meant affirming unity during uncertain times. It was a dessert drink that brought people together in laughter and song when the world outside felt harsh. Children remembered it as a reward at the end of long nights of celebration, while elders saw it as carrying forward a cultural link. Boiled custard was one of those rare recipes where the sweetness came not only from sugar, but also from togetherness. Pecan praline candy was a sweet fundraiser favorite, its brown sugar scent drifting across town squares and church parking lots during marches and community events. Fresh shelled pecans were coated in a bubbling mixture of sugar, cream, and butter, then cooled into glossy clusters that snapped with each bite. The rich caramel flavor and buttery crunch made them irresistible, while their portability made them perfect for sharing at rallies or selling to raise money for transportation and printing leaflets. Volunteers stirred the mixture over open flames or simple stovetops, working quickly before the candy hardened, a process that required both patience and skill. Children would watch wide-eyed as the shiny pralines set on wax paper, eager for the first taste. Though still beloved in some southern sweet shops, homemade pralines like these rarely appear on family tables today. They remain a delicious reminder of the grassroots efforts that fueled a movement, proving that even a simple candy could help sustain both morale and purpose in challenging times. Fig preserves cake held a special place in communities that relied on the harvest of what they grew themselves. Figs ripened in the summer and were quickly preserved to make sure nothing went to waste. A moist cake flavored with those preserves became a reliable dessert that worked for gatherings large and small. Families in farming areas often served it at church socials, where the figs represented both hard work and careful saving. The cake itself had a richness that made it feel celebratory even though it came from very simple roots. During the Civil Rights era, when people were reminded every day of how little they had, fig preserves cake brought a sense of continuity from one generation to the next. It was also a dessert that could be easily shared, sliced into squares for children running outside and adults seated around folding tables. The taste of figs sweetened with sugar told a story of both survival and joy. Okra fritters with cornmeal batter were a civil rights-era street food that brought communities together with a crisp bite and a burst of garden flavor. Fresh okra pods were sliced into thin rounds and stirred into a seasoned cornmeal batter with just enough buttermilk to hold everything together. Hot cast iron skillets of shimmering oil transformed the mixture into golden patties that sizzled and popped, releasing a savory aroma that drew crowds from blocks away. These fritters appeared at roadside stands, church fish fries, and grassroots rallies where neighbors gathered to share food and strength during uncertain times. The outside formed a crunchy crust, while the inside stayed tender and lightly sweet, letting the okra's earthy taste shine through. Served with a dash of hot sauce or a spoon of homemade relish, they were quick to cook and easy to share. As convenience foods and chain restaurants spread, this simple treat lost ground, but its memory lingers as a symbol of resilience, hospitality, and the power of a shared skillet meal during years of struggle and hope across the American South. Onion and potato hash cakes were one of those breakfasts that always felt hearty, even without meat. Potatoes and onions were grated, mixed with flour or cornmeal, and fried into crisp patties that could be eaten plain or with hot sauce if available. The dish was cheap, easy to prepare, and could stretch across several plates, making it ideal for large households. It was often made in the early mornings before children headed to school or adults to long shifts at work. The taste was simple but filling, a combination of flavors that became closely tied to daily life in tough years. Families leaned on it not only for its thrift, but for the comfort it gave in the face of uncertainty. Onion and potato hash cakes fueled countless mornings of determination, carrying people through struggles outside the kitchen. They became a dish remembered not just for their flavor, but for their role in sustaining courage and community. Corn pone pudding was one of those humble desserts that never really looked like much on the surface, but carried an emotional weight that made it unforgettable. Families in the South relied on cornmeal more than anything because it was affordable, filling, and always available, even when other ingredients were out of reach. Adding sugar and milk to turn it into a soft custard made it a sweet treat that worked for both ordinary evenings and Sunday gatherings. This pudding was never flashy or complicated, but it became the kind of recipe that everyone recognized from a grandmother's kitchen. During the Civil Rights era, desserts like this often appeared at church suppers where families pooled what they had to make sure everyone could share in something comforting. Corn pone pudding brought sweetness to moments of struggle and reinforced the idea that even the simplest ingredients could produce something memorable. Its presence at community gatherings was more than about flavor. It was about belonging and resilience. Carolina Gold Rice Pudding carried the aroma of low-country kitchens where the golden grains of this heirloom rice once ruled family dinners and Sunday suppers. Families simmered the prized rice in fresh milk until it turned tender and creamy, then folded in sugar, butter, and a whisper of nutmeg to create a dessert that felt like a warm embrace. The unique texture of Carolina Gold gave the pudding a silky body that regular long-grain rice could never match, making each spoonful feel both luxurious and familiar. Grandmothers often stirred in a handful of raisins or a splash of vanilla, letting the scent drift through the house while children waited impatiently for the first bite. It was a recipe born from African-American culinary traditions and the coastal fields of South Carolina and Georgia, carrying generations of history in every pot. Over time, the specialized grain nearly disappeared as mass-produced rice took its place, and with it, this beloved pudding faded from tables too. Today, it survives mainly in stories and rare heritage farms, a sweet reminder of a time when simple ingredients and patient stirring turned humble rice into a dessert worth celebrating at every family gathering. Cold cornbread and milk was often called the poor man's cereal, but it was more than a label, it was a lifeline. Day-old cornbread, often too dry to eat on its own, was crumbled into bowls and covered with milk or buttermilk, creating a filling meal that could be eaten quickly before school or work. For children, it was breakfast. For adults, it was sometimes supper, proving its versatility. It carried a tangy, comforting flavor that became familiar in many Southern households. What made it special was not the taste alone, but the reminder that nothing was wasted, not even stale bread. In communities with little to spare, this dish represented survival and practicality. Cold cornbread and milk was part of the rhythm of daily life, a dish that carried generations through hard times and into mornings of determination. Even with its simplicity, it gave people what they needed to keep going during days that demanded courage and endurance. Hummingbird cake was an early Southern creation that blended bananas, pineapple, and spices into a dense, flavorful dessert. Its tropical ingredients were unexpected but celebrated, representing a widening culinary horizon in the mid-20th century South. The cake was moist, rich, and often topped with cream cheese frosting, making it stand out from plainer sweets. At church potlucks and community rallies, a hummingbird cake drew attention immediately, showing pride in both taste and presentation. It became popular right around the years of the Civil Rights Movement, when gatherings often featured desserts that were meant to inspire joy despite hardship. Sharing a slice of hummingbird cake was a gesture of generosity and optimism, proof that even in hard times people could create something beautiful. The flavors were bold and comforting, reminding families that the South held both old traditions and new ideas worth cherishing. Hummingbird cake carried sweetness into places where strength was needed. Red rice with smoked sausage brought the flavors of the Gullah Geechee coast to dinner tables from South Carolina to Georgia, blending African techniques with local ingredients in a single bubbling pot. Long grain rice was simmered with tomatoes, onions, peppers, and fragrant spices until each grain absorbed a rich scarlet hue. Slices of smoked sausage added a savory depth and a hint of salt that made the dish satisfying enough to feed a crowd. Families loved it for Sunday suppers and late-night meetings alike because it required only one pan and filled the house with an irresistible aroma. Community cooks carried the recipe to rallies and church fundraisers where its bold color and hearty taste symbolized unity and celebration even in hard times. As processed rice mixes and quick dinners became the norm, authentic red rice slowly faded from everyday menus. What remains is the memory of a communal dish that carried centuries of African influence and a spirit of resilience in every spoonful. Cane syrup biscuits were one of the sweetest ways families could begin a day when sugar was a luxury. Freshly baked biscuits were split open and drizzled with thick cane syrup, a cheaper sweetener that was widely available in the South. This breakfast offered comfort and energy, especially for children heading to school or adults preparing for long days of labor. Cane syrup added richness to otherwise plain bread, transforming simple biscuits into a treat. It was a dish tied directly to the land, since cane syrup came from local harvests and represented self-reliance. Families treasured it because it gave sweetness without breaking the budget, a rare indulgence during lean times. Cane syrup biscuits became more than breakfast. They were symbols of hope, resourcefulness, and the sweetness people clung to even in struggle. The dish carried both nourishment and spirit, helping fuel resilience during mornings that demanded strength. For many, it was the taste of home and perseverance. Hoe cakes with cane syrup butter carried the flavor of history in every sizzling bite, linking enslaved African cooking techniques to the civil rights kitchens of the 20th century. Cornmeal was stirred with a splash of water or buttermilk to form a simple batter, then fried on a hot griddle or even the flat side of a farming hoe, which gave the dish its memorable name. When served hot, each thin cake was brushed with butter blended with dark cane syrup, creating a sweet glaze that soaked into the crisp edges. These cakes fed field workers at dawn, families after late meetings, and crowds gathered for marches, offering warmth and quick nourishment without expensive ingredients. The combination of smoky corn and caramel sweetness spoke of resourcefulness and survival. As breakfast menus shifted to boxed cereals and frozen waffles, hoe cakes gradually slipped from daily life. Yet their story remains a testament to perseverance and the deep roots of African American foodways that sustained both body and spirit during years of struggle and triumph. Stewed prunes with grits might sound plain today, but it was a dish that kept households nourished and children strong. Prunes were affordable, dried, and easy to store, making them a reliable sweetener when sugar was limited. Simmered until soft and paired with steaming bowls of grits, they turned into a balanced meal of fiber, sweetness, and filling grains. Large families often leaned on this combination because it could stretch far with little cost. For children, stewed prunes made breakfast feel less plain, while adults valued the strength it provided for long workdays. It was also a dish that traveled through generations, passed down as a memory of lean years and perseverance. Families carried bowls of this simple breakfast before marches, school, and shifts, finding strength in the comfort of familiarity. Stewed prunes with grits became a quiet but powerful dish of the civil rights era, proving that even the humblest meals could carry dignity and hope.
The war lasted 4 years. The cooking lasted forever. Every meal on this list was built from knowledge that passed from hand to hand, garden to garden, generation to generation, without once being written down. If there is one your family still makes, drop it in the comments and tell us who taught you. If there is one you have never tried, pick the simplest one, a handful of cornmeal and a fire. That is how it started. By the second winter of the war, the smokehouse was empty. The knowledge never was.